At my sister's lavish wedding reception in the Hamptons, the massive projector screen lit up not with a romantic montage, but with my face. The words flashed in bold neon letters across the display. Infertile, divorced, failure, high school dropout, broke, alone. 300 guests erupted into cruel, echoing laughter. My sister smirked from the head table, loudly warning everyone not to laugh too hard, because I might actually cry. My mother swirled her expensive wine while my father smiled and called it just a harmless joke. My tech CEO brother-in-law leaned in and whispered that the weak just have to take the hits. I simply smiled, reached into my designer clutch, and pulled out my phone. I typed one single word to my lawyer waiting outside. Begin. The massive LED screen flickered, the cruel video vanished, and the entire ballroom went dead silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Clara, 33 years old, and for my entire life I have been the designated punching bag of my family. I was the scapegoat, the one who never quite fit into their pristine, image-obsessed world. While they spent their days curating the perfect facade of wealth and social standing, I spent mine quietly building an empire they knew absolutely nothing about. As the founder and CEO of Apex Capital Solutions, a private equity firm specializing in hostile takeovers and financial crisis management for the ultra-wealthy, I handled multi-million-dollar acquisitions before breakfast. My family, however, still viewed me as the pathetic high school dropout who could not keep a husband or bear a child. They thought I was a broke failure scraping by in the city. I never corrected them. I preferred being underestimated. It gave me a distinct advantage, an advantage I was about to use to completely dismantle their lives. The setting for this ultimate betrayal was an obscenely expensive oceanfront estate in the Hamptons. The reception hall was a masterpiece of superficial extravagance. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from crystal chandeliers, catching the warm light of the setting sun over the Atlantic. Champagne flowed freely into imported crystal flutes, and a 12-piece orchestra played softly in the background. It was a picture-perfect scene designed to impress the 300 guests my parents had invited. These guests were a collection of fake elite social climbers and business associates my parents desperately wanted to impress. At the center of it all sat my younger sister Brittany. At 29 years old, she was the undisputed golden child of the family. She wore a custom bridal gown that cost more than most people earn in a year, her face perfectly contoured for the endless stream of social media posts she had been uploading all day. Beside her sat her new husband, Jamal Washington. Jamal was 34, an African-American tech founder with a massive ego and a supposedly booming startup. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he was marrying into a dynasty of established old money elites. He thought my parents were the financial titans they pretended to be. He had no idea that their entire lifestyle was a carefully constructed house of cards. I sat quietly at a terrible table near the kitchen doors, sipping sparkling water and observing the spectacle. I wore a simple but impeccably tailored black dress, keeping a low profile while the rest of my family paraded around the room. The evening had been proceeding exactly as expected until the lights suddenly dimmed. The orchestra stopped playing, and a spotlight hit the massive 200-inch LED screen positioned behind the head table. A voiceover announced that the bride had prepared a special presentation to celebrate family and the journey of love. I expected a montage of childhood photos or a sickly sweet romantic video of Brittany and Jamal. Instead, the screen flashed bright red, and a highly unflattering candid photograph of me appeared. I froze. The upbeat music shifted to a comical, mocking soundtrack. Bold, aggressive text stamped itself across my face on the screen. The first slide read "High School Dropout" in glaring yellow letters. The entire ballroom gasped, and then a ripple of uncomfortable laughter began to spread. I felt the blood rush to my ears. Yes, I had left high school early, but it was because I had to work 2 jobs to support myself after my parents kicked me out for not conforming to their ridiculous standards. I later earned my GED and taught myself high-level finance, but they only cared about the dropout label. The presentation did not stop there. The screen transitioned to a photo of me leaving a courthouse, shoulders slumped. The word divorced slammed onto the screen. The laughter in the room grew louder, more confident, fueled by the open amusement of my own family at the head table. Then came the most vicious blow. The screen turned black and a single clinical word appeared in stark white font: infertile. My breath caught in my throat. That was a deeply private, agonizing medical struggle that I had only shared with my mother in a rare moment of vulnerability years ago. She had taken my deepest pain and weaponized it for entertainment at a wedding reception. The final slide displayed a collage of my face with the words, "Failure, broke, and alone," flashing in an endless mocking loop. 300 guests were now erupting into cruel, echoing laughter. It was a tidal wave of humiliation washing over the room. People I did not even know were pointing at me, whispering behind their hands and chuckling at my expense. I looked toward the head table. Brittany was practically glowing with satisfaction. She leaned into her microphone, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Do not laugh too hard, everyone. Our little Clara might actually cry, and we do not want to ruin the aesthetic with her tears." I stood up from my chair. My legs felt heavy, but my mind was sharpening into a state of absolute icy clarity. The initial shock was evaporating, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I walked slowly across the ballroom floor toward the head table. The laughter died down slightly as people noticed my approach, expecting me to burst into tears or run out of the venue in shame. That was exactly what my family wanted. They wanted a public breakdown to confirm my status as the unstable, pathetic sister. I reached the edge of the head table and looked directly at my mother. Patricia sat there in her diamond-encrusted evening gown, casually swirling an expensive glass of red wine. "Mom," I said, my voice steady and perfectly audible in the quiet room, "tell them to turn it off. This is entirely inappropriate." Patricia rolled her eyes, taking a slow sip of her wine before looking down at me with utter disdain. "Oh, please, Clara," she sighed loudly. "You are always so terribly sensitive. It is just a little harmless fun. Are you really so bitter that you have to ruin your sister's special day with your jealousy?" "She cannot help it, Patricia." The voice came from the back of the room. I turned to see Trevor, my 35-year-old ex-husband, leaning against the bar with a smug grin on his face. Trevor was a greedy, unfaithful coward who had betrayed me, yet my parents had invited him to Brittany's wedding specifically to rub his presence in my face. He raised his whiskey glass in a mocking toast. She always lacked a sense of humor. My father, Richard, adjusted his silk tie and offered me a patronizing smile. "Clara, just go back to your seat. Do not make a scene. It was just a joke, sweetheart. Learn to laugh at yourself for once in your life." I turned my attention to Jamal. The groom was leaning back in his chair, his arm draped casually over Brittany's shoulders. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a clueless child. "Look!" Clara, Jamal said, his voice carrying the condescending tone of a man who thought he owned the world. I know this might be hard for someone who does not understand how real life works. But in the business world, in the circles of alpha predators where I operate, the weak just have to take the hits. You either build a thick skin or you get eaten alive. So do us all a favor, take the hit and go sit down. I stood there in the center of the lavish ballroom, surrounded by hostility, mockery, and absolute disrespect. My own mother had weaponized my infertility. My sister had orchestrated a public humiliation. My father had enabled the abuse, and my new brother-in-law had the audacity to lecture me about the business world. They truly believed I was a defenseless victim. They truly believed I was broke, powerless, and alone. They thought I was a sheep surrounded by wolves. They had no idea they had just backed a lion into a corner. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat or embarrassment. It was the smile of a woman who held the executioner's switch. I looked Jamal directly in the eye, my gaze locking onto his with terrifying intensity. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the ballroom. I opened my messages and found the chat with David, my lead corporate attorney, who was currently sitting in a black SUV just outside the estate gates waiting for my signal. I did not type a long emotional paragraph. I did not plead or argue. I typed one single fatal word. Begin. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my clutch. You are absolutely right, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the sudden quiet of the room. In the business world, the weak do get eaten alive. And you are about to find out exactly where you stand in the food chain. Less than 3 seconds later, the massive LED screen behind the head table flickered violently. The cruel, mocking slideshow of my face abruptly vanished, replaced by a harsh, glaring white background. The upbeat music cut out with a sharp screech of static, plunging the entire ballroom into a suffocating dead silence. Every head in the room turned toward the screen. Instead of photographs, a series of highly confidential red-stamped PDF documents began to populate the display. The text was massive, undeniable, and completely devastating. The era of the family disgrace was officially over, and the era of total catastrophic ruin for the people sitting at that head table had just begun. The first document to materialize on the towering screen was a federal court filing its stark black text, contrasting sharply against the glaring white background. It was a voluntary petition for non-individuals filing for bankruptcy under Chapter 11. Right below the bold heading was the name of the debtor, Oratech Incorporated. Beside the bankruptcy petition, a second document appeared on the massive LED display. It was a controlling interest transfer agreement heavily redacted in black ink, but showing unmistakable signatures at the bottom. The corporate seal of Apex Capital Solutions sat proudly next to the frantic, sprawling signature of the groom. The color drained from Jamal Washington's face so rapidly he looked as though he might collapse. The arrogant tech founder who mere seconds ago had advised me to take the hits and accept my humiliation was now staring at the screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the ballroom. The 300 guests, a mix of venture capitalists, socialites, and my parents' fake elite friends, suddenly realized they were not attending the wedding of a tech billionaire. They were attending the funeral of a fraud. "Turn it off!" Jamal bellowed, his voice cracking into a high pitch of panic. He lunged across the head table, his polished alpha male facade entirely gone. He knocked over a towering floral centerpiece and several crystal champagne flutes, sending wine and shattered glass crashing across the polished dance floor. He desperately scrambled toward the audio-visual cart, hidden behind the heavy silk drapery, frantically searching for a power cord to pull a switch to flip anything to stop the hemorrhaging of his deepest secrets. I did not move to stop him. Instead, I calmly picked up a nearby champagne flute and a silver dessert spoon. I tapped the glass 3 times. The sharp, clear ringing pierced through the mounting chaos in the ballroom, commanding absolute attention. "Do not rush, Jamal," I said, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear perfectly. "The audio-visual system is locked on a remote server. You cannot unplug the cloud. Besides, the guests need to know that the brilliant tech CEO standing on the podium actually only owns 2% of his own company." Jamal froze, his hands hovering over a tangle of thick black wires. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning realization. The cogs in his brain were finally turning, connecting the dots he had been too arrogant to see over the past 6 months. "You," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You are Apex. Apex Capital Solutions." I corrected my tone, pleasant but razor-sharp. "The faceless private equity firm that bought your toxic debt last month when your Series B funding fell through. You were so desperate for a lifeline that you signed the mezzanine financing agreement without having your legal team review the aggressive dilution clauses. Or maybe you did and you just assumed you could charm your way out of it like you always do." Brittany, standing amidst the ruined flowers on the head table, looked completely lost. Her carefully curated Instagram reality was short-circuiting. She grabbed Jamal's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive tuxedo jacket. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" Brittany demanded, her voice shrill. "What bankruptcy? You told me you just closed a $50 million funding round. You said we were buying a villa in Monaco next month. I did not let Jamal answer his panicked bride. I took a deliberate step closer to the head table, addressing my sister directly while ensuring the entire room caught every word. He lied, Brittany. Oratech has not been solvent for 8 months. Your new husband has been using vendor capital to lease his McLaren, rent that penthouse in Tribeca, and buy your custom designer wedding gown. He was floating on fumes, waiting for the apex capital injection to save him from federal indictments for corporate wire fraud. He is entirely broke. Jamal left the audiovisual cart and marched toward me, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The veins in his neck were bulging. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to regain some semblance of the intimidating physical presence he usually relied on to bully his subordinates. You breached the non-disclosure agreement, Jamal snarled, spitting the words at me. I will sue you into oblivion. I will take everything you own. I laughed, a genuinely amused, chilling sound that echoed through the quiet room. Sue me with what money, Jamal? I asked, tilting my head. As the controlling shareholder of Oratech, I froze all executive compensation packages yesterday afternoon. Your corporate credit cards have been declined since noon today. I am honestly surprised your caterers even showed up to serve this dinner. You do not have the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone launch a corporate lawsuit against a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I paused, letting the absolute finality of his financial ruin sink into his mind. You stood up there just moments ago and lectured me about the food chain. I reminded him, my voice dropping to a conversational yet deadly volume. You called me weak. You laughed while my sister humiliated my medical history on a screen rented with my own stolen money. You thought you were marrying a naive, broke woman's wealthy sister. You thought tying yourself to my parents' fabricated social standing would somehow legitimize your failing startup in the eyes of investors. The 300 guests were utterly captivated. Not a single person was walking toward the exit. They were watching a high-stakes corporate execution live at a wedding reception. I could see several prominent venture capitalists in the crowd, pulling out their smartphones, quietly typing messages under the tables, undoubtedly instructing their teams to sever all ties and cancel all pending meetings with Jamal Washington. Jamal's breathing was heavy and ragged. His chest heaved under his tailored suit. He looked wildly around the room, realizing that his entire professional network was watching his demise unfold in high definition. He looked toward my parents, expecting them to intervene, expecting Richard to use his supposed authority to shut me down. But Patricia and Richard were frozen in their seats, too stunned and too preoccupied with their own impending doom to offer him any salvation. You are a monster, Jamal spat, taking one aggressive step closer to me. I am a businesswoman, I corrected smoothly, holding my ground without flinching. I saw a distressed asset managed by an incompetent, arrogant founder, and I acquired it. That is the reality of the business world you claim to love so much. I gave you enough rope, Jamal, and you gladly tied the noose yourself. Let me explain exactly how you lost your company. I continued, making sure the investors in the room heard the precise mechanics of his failure. When you signed the restructuring agreement last Thursday, you triggered a convertible debt clause hidden in Section 4. Because Oratech failed to meet its quarterly revenue targets, which you falsified on your disclosures, my firm legally converted our debt into equity. We diluted your founder shares down to exactly 2.4%. You are no longer the CEO, Jamal. You are a minority shareholder with zero voting rights in a company currently undergoing federal liquidation. Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sob. My wedding, she cried, clutching the sides of her veil and looking desperately at the cameras that the hired photographers had slowly lowered. You are ruining my perfect wedding. Your wedding was ruined the moment you decided to use my infertility for a cheap laugh. I replied without looking at her, keeping my gaze locked firmly on Jamal. You wanted a show, Brittany. I am simply providing the entertainment. Jamal was physically shaking now. The reality of his absolute destruction was fully setting in. He had no company, no money, no leverage, and his carefully crafted reputation was currently burning to ash in front of the exact people he needed to impress. His alpha predator persona had been completely dismantled by the woman he had just publicly mocked as a failure. "You cannot do this," he whispered. The arrogance entirely drained from his voice, replaced by raw, unfiltered desperation. Apex promised that $50 million injection by midnight tonight. We have payroll, we have server costs. If that money does not hit the corporate accounts, the whole thing goes under. My employees lose everything. You should have thought about your employees before you spent their payroll on a Hamptons wedding reception, I replied coldly. I raised my phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen, ready to trigger the next phase of the demolition. The room was so quiet you could hear the ocean waves crashing against the beach outside the estate windows. Jamal broke the silence. His voice was a guttural shout that stripped away the last remnants of his dignity. "What the hell are you doing?" he screamed, his hands gripping the edge of the ruined head table. Apex Capital promised to inject $50 million by midnight to save me. They guaranteed that funding. We had a signed term sheet. You cannot just cancel a federal wire transfer because your feelings got hurt at a wedding. I took one deliberate step forward. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. "I am Apex," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to reach the furthest corners of the ballroom. And I officially froze that capital injection exactly 30 seconds ago. Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving. "You cannot do that," he breathed out, sounding like a desperate child. "I can, and I did," I replied. "I suggest you review the morality clause in Section 7 of our primary investment agreement. It explicitly states that any public scandal, defamation, or hostile behavior that jeopardizes the reputation of the managing partners will result in the immediate termination of all funding. You just stood on a stage and publicly slandered your primary investor. You mocked my medical history and allowed a defamatory video to be broadcast to 300 people. That is a textbook violation, Jamal. You breached the contract, which means the $50 million stays in my accounts and your company goes into immediate liquidation." The reality of his total ruin finally crashed down on him. Jamal staggered backward, bumping into the large wedding cake display. His eyes darted frantically around the room, meeting the shocked gazes of the venture capitalists and industry peers who were actively witnessing his professional execution. He had nothing left. No company, no leverage, no future in the tech industry. The empire he had bragged about was dead, killed by his own arrogance. Then a new kind of rage took over his features. The panic morphed into vicious, uncontrollable anger. He spun around, his eyes locking onto Brittany, who was still weeping into her veil. "You did this!" Jamal roared, pointing a shaking finger right at his bride's face. Brittany jumped, dropping her hands from her face. She looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Baby, no," she stammered. "I did not know. I swear I did not know she had money." "You told me she was a broke high school dropout," Jamal screamed, ignoring the gasps from the audience. He closed the distance between them, looming over her in her extravagant wedding dress. "You sat in our apartment for weeks planning this stupid video. You told me she was a pathetic loser we could use for a laugh to entertain your fake friends. You begged me to let you play that slideshow. You said it would be the highlight of the night." Brittany shrank back, pressing herself against the table. "I just wanted to put her in her place." She sobbed, her heavy makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "She always acted so superior when we were growing up. I just wanted everyone to know she was a failure. Her place," Jamal yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Her place is holding the keys to my entire existence. She literally owns my company. Because of your petty, childish jealousy, you just handed my life's work over to a corporate shark. Jamal, please." Brittany pleaded, reaching out to grab his sleeve. "We are married now. We are family. My parents will help us. They have money. Dad will write a check and fix this. We can start over." Jamal let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. "Your parents?" he scoffed, shooting a glare of pure disgust toward where my mother and father were sitting frozen in their chairs. "Your parents are as broke as I am. Did you really think I did not run a quiet background check on my future in-laws?" The only reason I went along with this circus was because I needed to keep up appearances for my own investors. I thought marrying into a prominent family would buy me time. I had no idea your entire family was a sinking ship. Brittany let out a loud gasp. She looked at our parents, waiting for them to deny Jamal's accusation, waiting for my father to stand up and declare his immense wealth. But Richard said nothing. Patricia was staring at her lap, her face pale and trembling. "You ruined me," Jamal said, turning his attention back to Brittany. His voice was no longer a scream, but a cold, venomous hiss. "I am bankrupt. My reputation is destroyed. The board will have me investigated for fraud by Monday morning, and it is all because I listened to a spoiled, brainless brat who wanted to play mean girl at her own wedding." Brittany covered her face and wailed loudly, a desperate attempt to play the victim and draw sympathy from the crowd. But the guests remained silent. The usual enablers who always rushed to comfort her were too terrified of the fallout to intervene. Even my mother, who had spent her entire life shielding Brittany from consequences, remained glued to her chair. Jamal stepped away from her in disgust. He ripped the expensive silk boutonniere from his tuxedo lapel and threw it onto the floor. "This wedding is a joke," he declared, addressing the entire room. "There is no money, there is no tech empire, there is just a group of broke frauds playing dress-up." He turned his back on Brittany, ignoring her frantic cries, and looked at me one last time. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated stare. He knew he was beaten. He knew I held all the cards, and he knew there was no legal loophole that could save him from the execution I had just orchestrated. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I did not gloat. I did not need to. The total collapse of his life was happening exactly as I had modeled it in my risk assessment portfolios. I raised my phone again. The room braced itself, knowing that the demolition was far from over. The first phase of my retaliation had been completed flawlessly, but Jamal was only the beginning. The screen behind the head table was about to reveal a reality my parents had spent years trying to hide. The massive LED screen behind the head table flashed again. The Oratech bankruptcy filings vanished. In their place, a new document rendered in glaring high definition illuminated the ballroom. It was a formal legal notice from one of the largest national banks in the country. The crest of the bank sat heavily at the top of the page, but it was the bold, underlined text in the center that drew every eye in the room. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. Below the devastating headline was the property address. It was not some obscure investment property. It was the address of my parents' famous $5 million estate, the very crown jewel of their fabricated wealthy identity. The document clearly detailed the outstanding balance, the penalties accrued, and the most damning piece of information of all. The account was exactly 6 months in arrears, 182 days of unpaid mortgage obligations. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. This was not just corporate gossip anymore. This was the public unmasking of high society frauds. The venture capitalists, the country club socialites, and the fake elite friends who had been drinking my parents' champagne all evening were now staring at the screen in absolute shock. Whispers erupted like a wildfire. People were pointing at the screen, reading the massive numbers aloud, confirming what was right in front of their eyes. My father finally broke from his paralyzed state. Richard marched across the ballroom floor, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished wood. His face was a violent shade of crimson, a stark contrast to the crisp white collar of his expensive tuxedo. For 33 years, that exact shade of red had signaled impending doom in our household. It was the look he wore right before he delivered a crushing punishment or a verbally abusive lecture that would leave me in tears for days. He stopped inches from my face, attempting to use his height to physically intimidate me. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of aged scotch and sheer panic. "Clara, turn that screen off right this instant," Richard hissed, keeping his voice low in a desperate bid to maintain the illusion of control. "You have had your little revenge. You humiliated the groom. You ruined your sister's reception. Now stop this childish tantrum before you destroy this family permanently. We have important people in this room. My investors are watching. You are making a mockery of my name." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked up at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel microscopic, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. Your name, I repeated, keeping my voice loud enough for the first few rows of tables to hear clearly. You think this is about your name, Dad? You sat there and smiled while your golden child broadcasted my medical trauma to 300 strangers. You called my deepest, most agonizing pain a harmless joke. You allowed them to label me a broke failure. You lost the right to demand my respect the second you chose to laugh at my suffering. Richard grabbed my wrist, his grip tight and bruising. I said, that is enough. He growled, his facade cracking further as the murmurs in the ballroom grew louder. You are a disgrace to this family. You always have been. Now fix that screen, or I swear to God, I will have security drag you out of here like the trash you are. I glanced down at his hand gripping my wrist, then back up to his eyes. Let me go, I commanded. The tone of my voice was so absolute, so devoid of fear, that he instinctively loosened his grip. I pulled my arm away and smoothed the fabric of my dress. You want to talk about being a disgrace, Dad? I asked smoothly. You want to talk about the people in this room? Let us talk about your precious investors. Let us show them exactly what kind of financial titan they are rubbing shoulders with. Look closely at the dates on that screen, everyone. I turned away from him and addressed the silent, captivated audience. Richard and Patricia love to host these lavish parties. They love to pour expensive champagne and judge those they deem beneath them. But that document proves they have not made a single mortgage payment on their primary residence in half a year. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings last Tuesday. They are completely bankrupt, living on maxed-out credit cards and predatory personal loans just to maintain the illusion of wealth. Richard looked over his shoulder at the display. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the back of a nearby guest chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The great patriarch of the family, the man who demanded absolute perfection and submission from everyone around him, was reduced to a hollow shell. He raised a shaking hand, trying to block the blinding light of the screen, a pathetic and entirely futile gesture. At the head table, my mother finally reacted. Patricia let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped her wineglass, shattering the crystal against the table and splashing red wine across the pristine white tablecloth. She scrambled to her feet, holding her hands over her face as if trying to physically hide from the glaring truth projected above her. No, Patricia wailed, her voice cracking in pure agony. Take it down! Take it down right now! It is a mistake! It is a clerical error! Richard turned back to me, his eyes wide and wild. He was hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into his lungs. How did you get this? He choked out, grasping his chest. These records are sealed. The bank promised confidentiality until the final notice. Did you really think a standard bank confidentiality clause applies? When the debt changes hands? I asked, my voice dripping with cold satisfaction. Richard stared at me, his jaw dropping open. What are you saying? I smiled, pointing to a small highlighted section at the very bottom of the document on the screen. Read the fine print, Dad. When you defaulted on the loan, the bank categorized your mortgage as a distressed asset. They bundled it into a high-risk portfolio and auctioned it off to a private equity firm to recoup their losses. Do you want to guess which private equity firm specializes in acquiring distressed, high-value real estate debt? Richard's eyes scanned the bottom of the colossal screen. He read the name of the acquiring entity out loud, his voice barely a whisper. Apex Capital Solutions. He looked back at me, the realization hitting him with the force of a freight train. You bought the debt. I bought the debt? I confirmed, nodding slowly. I own the mortgage to your $5 million estate, and because you are 6 months in default, I am legally executing the foreclosure. I am seizing the property. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before my security contractors arrive to change the locks and throw whatever cheap furniture you actually own out onto the street. Richard let out a strangled cry. He lunged forward, not in anger this time, but in sheer desperation. He grabbed my hands, his fingers clammy and trembling. Clara, please. He begged, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. The man who had called me a disgrace 5 minutes earlier was now weeping, holding my hands. "You cannot do this to us. Where will we go? We will be ruined. We will have nothing. You should have thought about that before you drained my college tuition fund to buy a Porsche Cayenne just to impress your country club friends," I replied, ripping my hands away from his grasp. I saw the shock register on the faces of the guests nearby. I was not going to stop there. I was going to expose every single skeleton in their perfectly curated closet. I was going to make sure that the action-based history of their cruelty was laid bare for the entire world to judge. "Yes, everyone," I said, raising my voice. My father called me a high school dropout on that screen earlier, but he conveniently forgot to mention why I dropped out. He did not tell you that when I was 18, he secretly emptied my entire college savings account. Money my grandparents had set aside specifically for my education. He drained it all so he could purchase a luxury sports car to keep up appearances because his business was already failing back then. He threw me out of the house with nothing but a suitcase because I confronted him about the theft. I had to work night shifts at a diner and clean office buildings just to survive while he drove around town playing the wealthy patriarch. Richard shrank back as if I had physically struck him. The guests surrounding us looked at him with absolute contempt. The narrative was permanently destroyed. He was no longer the successful, benevolent father. He was a thief who stole from his own teenage daughter to fund his fragile ego. Patricia rushed forward, pushing her way past the ruined chairs and shattered glass. She threw herself between Richard and me, her face a mess of ruined makeup and desperate tears. She reached out, trying to grab my shoulders, trying to employ the toxic maternal manipulation she had used to control the family for decades. "Clara, stop this madness!" Patricia wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "We are your family. You cannot put us on the street. We are your own flesh and blood. You are incredibly wealthy now. You have millions of dollars. Why would you buy our debt just to evict us? Why not pay off the mortgage and save our home? We gave you life. We raised you. You owe us." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life comparing me to my sister, who had mocked my career, who had called me broken and defective. She was using the word family as a shield, hoping to weaponize my guilt and force me back into submission. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt entirely liberated. "You want to talk about family, Mom?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "You want to talk about the sacred bond of blood? You want to remind me of what I owe you?" Patricia nodded frantically, hoping she had finally broken through to my emotions. "Yes, Clara. Family protects family. Please, just forgive us. Let us move past this." I stared directly into her desperate, tear-filled eyes. "Let us see if you still have the courage to say the word family when you see the next slide. Let us see how much blood matters when everyone in this room finds out exactly what you and your golden child did to me 5 years ago." I turned my gaze away from my mother and looked directly into the shadows near the ballroom doors. I found the man I was looking for. Trevor, my ex-husband, was trying to quietly slip out of the venue, desperately attempting to escape the blast radius of the explosion I had triggered. He did not make it far. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and David, my lead attorney, stepped into the ballroom accompanied by 2 massive stone-faced private security contractors. They blocked the exit immediately, crossing their arms and staring Trevor down. Trevor froze, trapped like a rat in a cage. I lowered my phone and let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the absolute panic radiating from the man who had once promised to love and protect me. Trevor looked wildly at David, then at the 2 massive security contractors flanking the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. He took a hesitant step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Clara, come on," Trevor stammered. His voice was entirely stripped of the smug, mocking confidence he had displayed by the bar just 10 minutes earlier. "This is family business. We do not need to involve security. Let me just walk out that door and we can handle this like adults tomorrow." "You lost the privilege of handling things privately the moment you decided to stand in that corner and drink a toast to my public humiliation," I replied, my voice carrying a lethal calm. You wanted to be part of the show, Trevor, so you are going to stay for the grand finale. I tapped my phone screen again. The glaring notice of my parents' foreclosure vanished instantly, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a bank statement. It was a joint medical savings account from 5 years ago. The logo of a premier fertility clinic sat at the top right corner. I turned my back on Trevor and addressed the 300 captivated guests. Everyone in this room saw the word infertile plastered across my face earlier tonight, I said, projecting my voice so it rang clearly over the silent crowd. My mother whispered it to her friends as a piece of scandalous gossip. My sister put it on a giant screen to get a cheap laugh. My ex-husband used it as the primary reason for our divorce, telling everyone in our social circle that I was a broken, barren woman who could not give him a family. I took a deep breath, locking eyes with my mother, who was now trembling visibly in her chair. But I am not infertile, and I never was. A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere went from shocked to deeply uncomfortably tense. 5 years ago, we were struggling to conceive. I continued pacing slowly in front of the head table. I desperately wanted to be a mother, so I worked myself to the bone. I took extra shifts, I picked up consulting gigs late into the night, and I saved every single penny I earned until I had exactly $80,000. It was enough to fully fund an elite specialized IVF treatment plan. That money was sitting in our joint medical account waiting to be paid to the clinic. I stopped pacing and glared at Trevor. Then one morning the clinic called to cancel my procedure. The funds had bounced. I rushed home in a panic. Trevor told me the bank made an error. Then he changed his story and told me the stock market had crashed and wiped out our investments. And while I was crying on the bathroom floor, completely devastated that my one chance to be a mother was gone, my husband was packing his bags. He handed me divorce papers that very afternoon and told everyone it was because he could not bear to be married to a woman who could not give him children. Trevor was sweating profusely now. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looking desperately around the room for an exit that did not exist. "Clara, please do not do this," he begged in a pathetic whisper. But he did not lose the money in a market crash, I announced, ignoring his pleas completely. He transferred it. Look at the screen. The image on the massive LED display changed. It was a wire transfer confirmation receipt. The document clearly showed the entire $80,000 moving out of the joint medical account. The receiving account name was highlighted in a bright, unmistakable yellow box. Brittany's private checking account. The silence in the room was so profound it was deafening. Every single pair of eyes slowly turned from the glowing screen to the bride standing at the head table in her pristine white gown. $80,000, I declared, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. Trevor stole my IVF funds and wired them directly to my own sister. Because Brittany had maxed out all of her credit cards, buying designer bags and luxury shoes to curate her fake influencer lifestyle. She was absolutely desperate to bag a wealthy tech CEO like Jamal, but she needed serious capital to keep up the charade of being a wealthy socialite. So she made a devil's bargain with my husband. Brittany was shaking her head frantically, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless bridal makeup. "No," she wailed. "No, that is not true. She is lying." "The bank records do not lie, Brittany," I snapped back, cutting her off instantly. "You gave Trevor a $20,000 kickback out of my stolen money as a reward for signing the divorce papers and taking the heat off you. You paid him to publicly humiliate me and blame the divorce on my body. And you used the remaining $60,000 to buy the very designer wedding dress you are wearing right now. You used my unborn child's fund to pay for luxury trips to Dubai so you could post photos on Instagram and catch Jamal's attention. You stole my future to fund your fake reality." Jamal, who had been standing frozen in the wreckage of the head table, slowly turned to look at his new wife. The man who had just lost his entire tech empire was now staring at Brittany with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You stole your own sister's baby fund?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of horror and disbelief. You stole a woman's IVF money so you could buy clothes to impress me. I did it for us. Jamal, Brittany cried out, reaching for him with trembling hands. I needed to look the part. I needed you to notice me. Jamal slapped her hands away as if her touch burned him. Do not touch me, he roared, stepping away from her in absolute disgust. You are sick. You are entirely sick in the head. At the back of the room, Trevor realized that his reputation was permanently destroyed. The entire room of elites, business owners, and socialites now knew him as the man who robbed his wife's medical fund and sold her out to her jealous sister. Faced with total social annihilation, Trevor defaulted to the only thing he actually cared about: greed. His panic suddenly morphed into a desperate, aggressive anger. He puffed out his chest and marched a few steps away from the security guards, pointing a finger at me. Fine, Trevor shouted, his voice echoing loudly. You want to air our dirty laundry? Go ahead. But let us talk about the law, Clara. Let us talk about assets. We were legally married when you started building this secret financial empire of yours. If you are the CEO of Apex Capital Solutions and you started acquiring distressed debt and massive assets before our divorce was finalized, that means I am entitled to half of it. You hid marital assets from me during discovery. I will hire the best lawyers in the state, and I will sue you for 50% of everything you own. You think you won tonight? You just admitted to hiding billions from your legal spouse. I could not help it. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, joyful laugh. The sound of my amusement cut through his aggressive posturing like a knife. I was waiting for you to say that, Trevor. I replied, a cold smile playing on my lips. I tapped my phone screen one more time. The wire transfer receipt vanished. A new, dense legal document appeared on the screen. It was several pages long, bearing the official seal of the state court, with multiple signatures at the very bottom. Do you remember the night you finalized our divorce? I asked, my tone conversational, but laced with venom. You came home completely drunk after celebrating with your new girlfriend. You threw the divorce papers on the kitchen counter and demanded I sign them immediately so you could go on a weekend trip to Cabo. You were in such a rush to leave me, such a rush to get away from the broken, barren woman. You blindly slid a stack of papers at me. But you were so intoxicated and so arrogant that you did not bother to read the final document I slid back to you for your signature. Trevor squinted at the massive screen. The blood drained from his face as he recognized his own messy signature at the bottom of the projected page. That is a post-nuptial agreement, Trevor, I announced loudly. I had David draft it the day I realized the IVF money was missing. It clearly states that in the event of our divorce, you waive all rights past, present, and future to any business entities, investments, capital, or intellectual property I generate. You signed it right there on the bottom line. You legally gave up any claim to Apex Capital Solutions for absolutely nothing. Trevor's jaw dropped. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. You tricked me, he breathed out, sounding completely defeated. I protected myself from a thief, I corrected sharply. But it gets much worse for you, Trevor. Stealing $80,000 from a joint account is bad. But doing it by forging my signature on the wire transfer authorization form at the bank, that is a federal crime. It is called wire fraud. And because the money crossed state lines into Brittany's offshore accounts, it elevates it to a felony offense. I gestured toward the back of the room where my lawyer was standing. David did not just come here tonight to watch the show. He spent the entire afternoon at the district attorney's office. He has already handed the physical evidence, the forged wire transfers, the bank statements, and the digital footprints directly to the federal authorities. Trevor looked at David, then at the two massive security guards. His knees visibly shook. He was not just broke and publicly humiliated. He was going to federal prison. He was not just broke and publicly humiliated. He was going to federal prison. The absolute finality of Trevor's fate hung heavily in the air. The ballroom was so quiet that the sound of the ocean breeze rattling the expensive glass windows of the Hamptons estate seemed deafening. The 300 guests were entirely paralyzed, trapped in their seats, as they witnessed the systematic, ruthless execution of every person who had ever wronged me. Then a sudden piercing shriek shattered the silence. It was my mother. Patricia could no longer maintain the fragile, crumbling facade of her sanity. The sheer magnitude of the destruction surrounding her, the loss of her $5 million mansion, the bankruptcy of her new son-in-law, and the terrifying realization of my immense wealth and power completely broke her mind. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her knees hitting the ground so hard I could hear the impact. Her designer evening gown pooled around her in a chaotic mess of expensive silk and spilled red wine. She clawed at her own hair, ruining the elaborate updo she had spent hours at the salon perfecting. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with her heavy makeup to create dark, muddy streaks across her cheeks. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, judgmental matriarch who had been swirling her wine and laughing at my pain just 30 minutes ago. She looked like a desperate, terrified animal caught in a trap of her own making. "We are your family!" Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the shards of broken crystals scattered across the floor from the fallen centerpieces. She reached out her trembling fingers, grasping at the hem of my black dress. "We are your blood." I took a deliberate step backward, pulling my dress out of her reach. I looked down at her, feeling no pity, no sadness, and absolutely no remorse. I felt only the cold, sterile satisfaction of a surgeon cutting out a malignant tumor. "You have millions of dollars," Patricia wailed, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You own Apex Capital. You have more money than all of us combined. If you are so rich, why did you not just pay off our debt? Why did you not just write a check to the bank and save our home? Why did you purposely go behind our backs to buy our mortgage just so you could evict your own parents? What kind of sick, twisted monster does that to the people who gave her life?" She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The guests watched in horrified fascination. Richard remained slumped against a chair, too utterly broken and humiliated to even attempt to comfort his wife. "I gave you life!" Patricia cried, raising her head again to appeal to the crowd, desperately hoping to find a single sympathetic face among the wealthy socialites and investors. "I carried her for 9 months. I fed her. I put a roof over her head. And this is how she repays us. She gets rich and decides to torture her own parents. She is destroying her sister's wedding day out of pure psychotic spite. We made mistakes, yes. But we are a family. You do not do this to family." Her voice echoed through the massive hall, a pathetic symphony of toxic manipulation and victimhood. She was utilizing the exact same playbook she had used my entire life, weaponizing the concept of familial obligation to excuse her own horrendous behavior. I let her cry. I let her scream. I stood perfectly still and allowed her to display her absolute lack of accountability to every single person in the room. When her sobs finally began to subside into ragged, desperate gasps for air, I spoke. "A family," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath just to hear me. "You want to talk to me about family, Mom? Let us define what that word actually means in this household." I took a slow, measured step toward her. She shrank back slightly, her hands trembling against the polished floor. "Was it family? When I was 19 years old, hospitalized with severe pneumonia, and you refused to co-sign a tiny medical loan for my treatment because you claimed it might temporarily lower your credit score right before your luxury kitchen remodel?" I asked, stating the facts with the clinical precision of a prosecutor. "Was it family when you secretly sold the vintage pearl necklace my grandmother explicitly left to me in her will just so you could afford the annual membership dues at the Oak Ridge Country Club?" Patricia opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. The guests sitting at the tables closest to us gasped audibly. I was stripping away every single layer of her manufactured high society identity, exposing the greedy, shallow core beneath. "Was it family when you told your friends I was working overseas because you were too utterly ashamed to admit your daughter was building a business from the ground up without your money?" I continued, my voice gaining a sharp, undeniable edge. "You did not want to pay off your debt, Mom. You wanted to keep living a lie. You wanted to keep drinking expensive champagne and wearing designer gowns while drowning in millions of dollars of loans you had absolutely no intention of repaying." I crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. My eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "If I had simply paid off your mortgage, you would have learned nothing," I whispered fiercely. "You would have taken my money, patted yourself on the back, and continued treating me like garbage. You would have kept funding Brittany's delusions of grandeur. You would have kept acting like the reigning queen of a kingdom built on quicksand. I did not buy your debt to torture you. I bought it to foreclose on your lies. I bought it to hold you accountable for the very first time in your entire miserable life." Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head back and forth as if trying to physically block out my words. "We love you," she sobbed, clutching her chest. "Deep down, we have always loved you. We are a family, Clara. Please, you have to stop this. You have ruined Jamal. You have sent Trevor to jail. You are putting your father and me on the street. Have you not done enough? Look at your sister. Look at what you are doing to her. She is a bride on her wedding day. Please, for the sake of this family, just walk away." I stood back up, smoothing out my dress. I looked over at Brittany. My sister was standing near the edge of the head table, her face pale, her hands gripping the white tablecloth so hard her knuckles were completely white. She looked absolutely terrified. I turned my attention back to my mother, who was still kneeling in the spilled wine and broken glass, begging for mercy under the guise of family loyalty. "Let us see if you still have the courage to say the word family," I said, my voice echoing with icy, devastating finality when you see the next slide. At my command, the massive LED display behind the head table shifted once again. The foreclosure notice faded into the digital ether, and the bright white background was instantly replaced by the stark, undeniable crispness of a scanned bank statement. The logo of a premier national bank sat at the top left corner, but it was the account holder information that made the blood freeze in the veins of one specific man in the room. Trevor was not a brave man. He was an opportunist, a parasite who attached himself to whoever offered the easiest path to luxury and comfort. He had spent the last 5 years living off the spoils of his betrayal, convinced he had gotten away with the perfect crime. He had even shown up to this wedding to gloat standing by the open bar, drinking top-shelf whiskey on my parents' dying dime and laughing at the video designed to break me. But Trevor was also a man who recognized his own handwriting, and he recognized the exact sequence of digits flashing in bold black ink across the 200-inch screen. Even before the specific transaction details fully rendered on the display, Trevor knew exactly what was happening. I watched from the center of the ballroom as his arrogant, smug demeanor shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The glass of expensive whiskey slipped from his trembling fingers, plummeting to the floor and shattering against the hardwood. The sharp crash made several guests jump, drawing their attention to the back of the room. Trevor did not even look down at the mess he had made. His eyes were blown wide, fixed in absolute horror on the screen. He took one step backward, then another. His survival instincts finally kicked in, overriding his shock. He turned his back on the head table, abandoning my family, abandoning the bride he had conspired with, and made a desperate, frantic dash for the main exit. He shoved past a group of bewildered venture capitalists, knocking a chair out of his way. He was practically sprinting across the foyer, his eyes locked on the heavy brass-handled oak doors that led out to the estate gardens. He thought he could just slip away into the night. He thought he could escape the blast radius of the explosion he had helped orchestrate 5 years ago. He reached out his sweaty palm, grasping the cold brass handle. He pulled with all his might. The door did not budge. Trevor yanked the handle again, letting out a panicked, breathless grunt. That was when the shadows in the foyer shifted. David, my lead corporate attorney, stepped forward from the alcove. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit with the calm, methodical precision of a predator cornering its prey. David was not just a lawyer, he was a legal executioner, and he had been waiting for this exact moment all evening. "Going somewhere, Trevor?" David asked, his voice low, smooth, and laced with absolute authority. Trevor stumbled backward, his back hitting the heavy oak doors. "Move out of my way," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You cannot hold me here. This is false imprisonment. I am leaving. I am walking out that door right now." Trevor tried to step around David, attempting to force his way toward the secondary exit, but David did not even have to lift a finger. Two massive private security contractors stepped out from behind David, instantly blocking Trevor's path. They were built like brick walls, dressed in immaculate black suits, their arms crossed over their broad chests. They stared down at Trevor with blank, unblinking expressions. They did not say a word, but the physical barrier they formed was impenetrable. Trevor collided hard against the chest of the contractor on the left. The guard did not yield a single inch. Instead, he simply flexed his shoulder, sending Trevor stumbling backward until he tripped over his own feet and landed hard on the polished floor. "I strongly advise against attempting to assault my security personnel," David said, looking down at Trevor with mild disgust. "You are already facing enough legal jeopardy tonight. Adding assault and battery to your impending federal charges would be highly inadvisable." From the center of the ballroom, I picked up the wireless microphone that had been abandoned on a nearby table. I tapped it once, ensuring the audio was perfectly clear. "Leaving so soon?" "Trevor," I asked, my voice booming through the venue's surround sound speakers. The entire crowd of 300 guests pivoted instantly, their eyes locking onto the pathetic figure scrambling on the floor at the back of the room. "I thought you wanted to stay and enjoy the comedy show. You were laughing so hard just 15 minutes ago. Why stop now?" Trevor scrambled to his feet, dusting off his suit jacket with violently shaking hands. "Clara, listen to me," he yelled across the room, his voice echoing with sheer desperation. "You are crossing a legal line here. You cannot hold me against my will. You cannot show my private financial records to a room full of strangers. I will sue you. I will drag you through court for defamation." I laughed, a harsh, unforgiving sound. "Defamation requires the presentation of false statements, Trevor. Nothing on that screen behind me is false. And as for your privacy, that is a joint bank account. My name is on the header right next to yours. I have every legal right to display my own financial records." I raised my hand and gestured toward the massive screen. "Let us direct our attention back to the presentation, everyone," I announced. "I promise you this slide is far more entertaining than the fabricated garbage my sister subjected you to earlier." The image on the screen zoomed in, magnifying a specific, highlighted section of the bank statement. The date was clearly visible. It was 5 years ago, exactly 3 days before Trevor had abruptly handed me divorce papers. "Look closely at the highlighted transaction," I instructed the silent, captivated audience. "What you are looking at is a domestic wire transfer. The amount is exactly $80,000. It drained the account down to a balance of 0. Trevor shook his head frantically. He pressed himself against the heavy oak doors, looking like a trapped animal. "Do not," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Clara, please. I will pay it back. I will find a way to pay you back every single cent. Just turn the screen off." "You cannot pay back what you do not have," I replied coldly. "And this is not about getting my money back, Trevor. This is about establishing the truth. For 5 years, you walked around telling everyone in our social circle that you divorced me because I was a broken, defective wife. You played the role of the tragic, supportive husband who was forced to leave a woman who could not give him a family. You soaked up everyone's sympathy while I was left to deal with the public humiliation." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the back of the room, closing the distance between us. The guests parted like the Red Sea, clearing a path for me. "But you did not leave me because of a medical issue?" I continued, my voice echoing with righteous fury. "You left me because you are a thief. You saw an account with $80,000 of hard-earned cash money I worked 16-hour days to save, and you decided you wanted to cash out. But you had a problem, did you not, Trevor? That account required dual authorization for any withdrawal over $10,000. I pointed at the screen. The image shifted again, displaying a highly magnified scan of the wire transfer authorization form. 2 signatures sat at the bottom of the page. One belonged to Trevor. The other was supposed to be mine. "Look at the second signature, everyone," I commanded. "That is supposed to be my name. But I never signed that document. I was at work, sitting in a windowless office trying to earn a bonus, while my husband was sitting in a bank branch deliberately forging my signature on a federal financial document." A collective murmur of disgust swept through the crowd. The venture capitalists and business executives in the room fully understood the severity of what they were looking at. This was not a messy divorce dispute. This was a severe, documented white-collar crime. It was a mistake, Trevor cried out, tears actually streaming down his face now. I made a mistake. I was desperate. I was drowning in debt. I did not know what else to do. You were not drowning in debt, I shot back, my voice cracking like a whip. You were drowning in greed. You forged my signature, bypassed the bank's security protocols, and authorized the transfer of $80,000. That is not a mistake, Trevor. That is felony wire fraud. And because you deliberately used fraudulent means to extract funds from a federally insured institution, it carries a mandatory minimum sentence. David stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He looked at Trevor with the cold, calculating gaze of a man who had already won the war. My client is absolutely correct, David stated, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. Title 18. United States Code Section 1343. Wire fraud. When combined with aggravated identity theft for the forgery of Mrs. Clara's signature, the federal sentencing guidelines dictate a severe penalty. You are not facing a civil lawsuit, Trevor. You are facing a federal indictment. Trevor's legs finally gave out. He slid down the heavy wooden doors, collapsing onto the floor in a pathetic heap of ruined expensive fabric and shattered ego. He buried his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. The arrogant man who had mocked me from the bar was completely gone. But the money did not just vanish into thin air, I announced, pulling the attention of the room back to the main event. I turned around and looked directly at the head table, locking eyes with the bride who was still trembling in her custom wedding gown. Trevor did not keep the $80,000 for himself. He was just the middleman. He was just the coward hired to execute the theft. I raised my microphone, aiming my next words like a loaded weapon directly at my sister. Tell them where the money went. Brittany, I demanded, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. Tell your new husband, tell your guests, and tell your parents exactly whose bank account received that $80,000 wire transfer. Brittany stood absolutely paralyzed at the head table. The heavy silk of her custom wedding gown seemed to weigh her down, pinning her to the exact spot where her perfect life was about to end. She stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, desperately hoping I would somehow show mercy. She hoped I would adhere to the unspoken family rule that dictated I must always protect her image at the expense of my own sanity. But that rule died the moment she flashed the word infertile on that screen. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I raised my hand, and the massive LED display behind her shifted. The fraudulent wire transfer authorization form vanished, replaced by a high-resolution screenshot of a different bank statement. This one belonged to a private offshore account. The name at the top of the statement was highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow: Brittany Ann. The transaction history on the screen was damning. It showed an incoming wire transfer of exactly $60,000 originating directly from the joint medical account Trevor had drained. Look closely at the numbers, everyone, I instructed the silent ballroom. My voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. The math is quite simple. Trevor stole $80,000 from my IVF fund. He wired $60,000 directly to my sister's private account. He kept the remaining $20,000 as his personal commission for executing the theft. A wave of revulsion swept through the crowd. Guests who had previously been enjoying their expensive champagne were now setting their glasses down, entirely disgusted by the sheer depravity of the revelation. You see, Brittany had a serious problem 5 years ago. I continued, pacing slowly toward the center of the room. She had cultivated this immaculate, wealthy socialite persona on social media. She desperately wanted to break into the elite tech circles, attend the exclusive yacht parties, and trap a wealthy founder like Jamal. But maintaining that fake reality was incredibly expensive. She had maxed out every single credit card she owned. She was drowning in retail debt, and my parents were too broke to bail her out. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my sister. She was shaking her head frantically, but no words were coming out. Her perfectly contoured face was a mask of sheer terror. She needed capital, I stated coldly. She needed cash to buy the first-class tickets to Dubai, the limited edition designer bags, and the VIP table access required to get close to the men she wanted to manipulate. So she looked around for an easy target, and she found one sitting right in her own family. She found me. Brittany finally broke. No, she wailed, her voice high and erratic. That was an investment. Trevor gave me that money as an investment for my brand. I did not know what it was for. Do not insult my intelligence and do not insult the intelligence of everyone in this room. I snapped back, my voice echoing like thunder. You knew exactly what that money was for. I confided in you. I told you about the hormone injections, the painful treatments, the endless doctor appointments. I cried on your shoulder about how desperately I wanted to be a mother. I trusted you with my deepest vulnerability, and you took that trust, walked straight to my husband, and orchestrated a heist to steal my unborn child's future so you could buy Prada handbags. At the back of the room, Trevor tried to speak up from his pathetic position on the floor. It was her idea, he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Brittany. She came to me. She said you were too focused on your career anyway. She promised me $20,000 if I just signed the paperwork and walked away. I was broke. I needed the cash. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. Trevor had just confessed to a federal crime in a room full of witnesses, desperately trying to throw his co-conspirator under the bus to save his own skin. He is lying, Brittany screamed, pointing back at him. He is a liar. He hated you, Clara. He wanted to leave you and he used me to get the money out. I do not care whose idea it was, I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that forced the entire room to lean in just to hear me. You both executed it flawlessly, but the theft was not even the most wicked part of your plan. The money was just the beginning. I turned away from Brittany and looked at the audience. The real cruelty was the cover story they invented to hide the theft. Trevor needed a reason to suddenly divorce me that would not raise any suspicions about the missing funds. He needed to play the victim so no one would look too closely at the finances. And Brittany needed a way to ensure I would be too devastated, too humiliated, and too broken to ever investigate where my savings went. I looked back at Trevor, who was now weeping openly on the floor, guarded by my security contractors. So they concocted the perfect lie, I said. Trevor packed his bags, handed me divorce papers, and told all of our friends, our family, and everyone in our social circle that he was leaving me because I was infertile. He told everyone I was a barren, defective woman who could not give him a family. He sat at dinner parties and played the tragic, heartbroken husband, soaking up sympathy while I was completely ostracized. I turned my fierce gaze back to the head table, looking directly at my parents. Patricia and Richard were completely frozen. Their faces were drained of blood. They had spent the last 5 years enabling this lie, using my supposed infertility as a weapon to mock me and elevate their golden child. And you all believed it, I said, addressing my parents directly. You embraced the lie because it fit your narrative. It was easier to brand me a failure than to admit your golden child was a sociopathic thief. You whispered about my broken body behind my back. You let Brittany use my trauma as a punchline for a slideshow at her wedding. You weaponized the very pain she caused me to get a cheap laugh. Jamal had been standing motionless amidst the wreckage of the head table. His brain had been struggling to process the rapid, catastrophic sequence of events. He had just lost his tech company. He had just been publicly exposed as a financial fraud. But the realization of what his new wife had done finally penetrated his shock. He slowly turned his head to look at Brittany. His eyes were wide, filled with a horrific, chilling realization. The woman standing next to him was not just a spoiled, wealthy socialite. She was a monster. You stole from a baby fund, Jamal asked, his voice shaking with absolute revulsion. The money you used to buy your wardrobe, the money you used to fly to the tech summits where we met. It was stolen medical money. Jamal, baby, listen to me, Brittany pleaded, reaching out to grab his hands. She was crying hysterically now, her facade entirely shattered. I did it for us. I did it so I could find you. I just wanted a good life. I just wanted to be beautiful for you. Do not touch me! Jamal roared violently, shoving her hands away. He took a massive step backward, looking at her as if she were covered in a deadly virus. You are repulsive. You used me. You targeted me using money you stole from your own sister. You thought you were so clever, playing the rich heiress, bragging about your family's wealth, and you are nothing but a common criminal wearing stolen clothes. He turned his back on her, his breathing heavy and erratic. He looked at the massive screen displaying her offshore account. then looked down at his own ruined tuxedo. "This entire marriage is a sham," Jamal announced to the silent room. "There is no wealth here. There is only theft and fraud. I am completely bankrupt, and I just married a felon. This wedding is officially canceled." "No," Brittany wailed, falling to her knees in the center of the dance floor. The heavy layers of her $20,000 wedding gown pooled around her in a massive, pathetic cloud of white tulle. She reached out toward Jamal, grasping at the empty air. "You cannot leave me. We signed the papers. We are husband and wife." Jamal let out a bitter, soulless laugh. "I will have the annulment papers drawn up by Monday morning," he spat. "I will cite fraud. You misrepresented your assets, your background, and your entire identity. Good luck paying for a divorce lawyer with frozen accounts." He turned and stormed away from the head table, shoving past the stunned guests as he made his way toward the secondary exit. He did not look back. He did not say another word. The arrogant tech founder who had tried to lecture me about the food chain was running away into the night, stripped of his company, his wealth, and his fake bride. Brittany collapsed completely, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed into the hardwood floor. Her perfect Instagram-worthy wedding had transformed into a public execution. The elite guests she had tried so desperately to impress were now looking down at her with absolute disgust. She was no longer the beautiful, wealthy bride. She was an exposed thief crying in a stolen dress. I stood in the center of the room and looked down at her. I felt no sympathy. The woman weeping on the floor was the same woman who had coldly drained my bank account and smiled while I cried over my empty nursery. She had earned every single second of this devastation. But my retaliation was not quite finished. Exposing her to the guests was the emotional punishment. Now came the legal execution. I raised my hand and signaled to David at the back of the room. "It is time," I said softly into the microphone. David nodded. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He typed a quick message and hit send. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open one final time. The two men in sharp, dark suits stepped into the grand foyer. They did not look like wedding guests. They moved with the rigid, unmistakable discipline of federal law enforcement. The gold badges clipped to their belts caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. Trevor, still trapped between my private security contractors, caught sight of the badges. The remaining color in his face completely vanished. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route, but the walls were closing in rapidly. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized his entire body, but Trevor was a cornered rat, and cornered rats do not simply surrender, they bite. His sheer terror suddenly morphed into a desperate, aggressive rage. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from the security guards and pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You think you have won, Clara!" Trevor shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. "You think you can just snap your fingers and send me to prison? But you are forgetting one massive, glaring detail about your little secret empire." I tilted my head, studying his pathetic attempt at intimidation. "Please, Trevor," I said smoothly. "Enlighten me. You built Apex Capital Solutions while we were still legally married." He sneered, a desperate, ugly smirk forming on his face. "You started acquiring distressed debt, launching shell companies, and amassing all this capital before our divorce was finalized. Do you know what that means under state law? It means every single cent you earned, every company you founded, and every asset you acquired during that time is marital property." A few gasps rippled through the crowd of venture capitalists and socialites. They knew the law. In a standard divorce, hiding assets of this magnitude during discovery was a massive legal violation. Trevor thought he had just found his get-out-of-jail-free card. "I will hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the country," Trevor threatened, taking a confident step forward. "I will drag you back into court and petition to reopen our entire settlement. I will tell the judge you deliberately hid billions of dollars from your legal spouse. I am entitled to 50% of everything you own, Clara. Half of Apex Capital belongs to me. You want to press charges for a miserable $80,000. Go ahead, because I am going to sue you for half of your entire net worth." He crossed his arms, staring at me with a look of absolute triumph. He honestly believed he had me trapped. He believed the threat of losing half my empire would force me to call off the federal agent standing at the door. I stood perfectly still. I looked at the man who had abandoned me at my lowest point, the man who had stolen my future and blamed it on my body, and I could not help it. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, joyous laugh. The sound of my pure amusement cut through his aggressive posturing like a serrated blade. Trevor's smug smile faltered. I was wondering how long it would take your greedy parasitic brain to realize the timeline, I replied, my voice ringing with cold satisfaction. I raised my hand and signaled David. The massive LED screen behind the head table shifted once again. The bank statements and offshore account details vanished. A new dense legal document appeared in high definition. It was several pages long, bearing the official seal of the state court, with multiple signatures at the very bottom. "Do you remember the night you finalized our divorce?" I asked, pacing slowly across the polished dance floor. "You came home completely drunk after celebrating your freedom with the new girlfriend you were already seeing behind my back. You threw the divorce papers on the kitchen counter and demanded I sign them immediately so you could go on a weekend trip to Cabo. You were in such a rush to leave me, such a rush to get away from the broken, barren woman who could not give you a family." Trevor squinted at the massive screen. His breathing hitched. "You blindly slid a stack of papers at me," I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. "But you were so intoxicated and so arrogant that you did not bother to read the final document I slid back to you for your signature." Trevor's eyes locked onto the bottom of the projected page. He recognized his own messy, hurried signature scrawled across the signature line. "That is a post-nuptial agreement, Trevor," I announced loudly. I had David draft it the exact same day I realized my IVF money was missing. It clearly and explicitly states that in the event of our divorce, you waive all rights past, present, and future to any business entity's investments, capital, or intellectual property I generate. You signed it right there on the bottom line. You legally surrendered any claim to Apex Capital Solutions for absolutely nothing." Trevor's jaw dropped. His hands fell limply to his sides. He stared at the screen, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He had literally signed away a multi-billion-dollar empire so he could catch a flight to Mexico. "You tricked me," he breathed out, sounding completely defeated. "I protected myself from a thief," I corrected sharply. "But it gets much worse for you, Trevor. You thought this was just a messy civil dispute over hidden funds, but stealing $80,000 from a joint account is not just a marital spat." I turned to the audience, ensuring every business executive in the room understood the severity of his crime. "You had a major problem when you decided to drain that account, Trevor. It required dual authorization for any withdrawal over $10,000. The image on the screen shifted to a highly magnified scan of a bank wire transfer authorization form. 2 signatures sat at the bottom of the page. One belonged to Trevor, the other was supposed to be mine. "Look at the second signature, everyone," I commanded. "That is supposed to be my name. But I never signed that document. I was at work trying to earn a bonus while my husband was sitting in a bank branch deliberately forging my signature on a federal financial document." David stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He looked at Trevor with the calculating gaze of an apex predator. "My client is absolutely correct," David stated, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. Title 18, United States Code. Section 1343, Wire Fraud. When combined with aggravated identity theft for the forgery of Mrs. Clara's signature, the federal sentencing guidelines dictate a severe penalty. Because the money crossed state lines into Brittany's offshore accounts, it elevates the crime to a felony offense. David gestured toward the 2 men waiting by the doors. "You are not facing a civil lawsuit, Trevor. You are facing a federal indictment." I handed the physical evidence, the forged wire transfers, the bank statements, and your digital footprints directly to the authorities this afternoon. Trevor's legs completely gave out. He slid down the heavy wooden doors, collapsing onto the floor in a pathetic heap of ruined fabric and shattered ego. He buried his face in his hands, trembling violently. The arrogant man who had toasted to my humiliation was now waiting to be fitted for a pair of handcuffs. The federal agent stepped fully into the ballroom. They bypassed David, their polished black shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with terrifying purpose. They flanked Trevor, hauled him to his feet by his armpits, and spun him around. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Trevor did not fight them. He let his head hang in absolute defeat as they marched him back through the heavy oak doors, taking him away to face the federal consequences of his greed. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing his fate. The attention of the entire room immediately snapped back to the head table. Brittany was hyperventilating. The reality of Trevor being hauled off in handcuffs had finally penetrated her thick skull. She was not just a spoiled bride caught in a lie. She was a co-conspirator who had received $60,000 of stolen funds across state lines. She was an accessory to a federal felony. The pristine, untouchable bubble she had lived inside her entire life was popping, and the sheer terror of it was driving her completely insane. A primal, ear-piercing shriek tore from her throat. The sound was so violent and unhinged that several guests physically recoiled. Brittany slammed her fists onto the head table, her perfectly manicured nails catching the expensive linen. "You ruined my life!" She screamed, her vocal cords straining as she glared at me with absolute unfiltered hatred. Before anyone could react, Brittany grabbed a heavy crystal goblet filled with red wine. With a vicious snarl, she hurled it directly at my head. I did not flinch. I simply tilted my head a fraction of an inch to the right. The heavy goblet sailed past my ear and smashed violently against a marble pillar behind me. The crystal shattered into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments, sending a massive splash of dark red wine exploding across the white wall. My private security contractors immediately surged forward to intercept her, but I raised a single hand, halting them in their tracks. I wanted to watch this. I wanted everyone in this room to witness the spectacular, unhinged collapse of the family golden child. "You are a psychopath," Brittany wailed, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me. She turned wildly to the audience, desperately trying to salvage her shattered image, frantically attempting to deploy the victim card she had relied on since childhood. "Look at her. Look at what she is doing. She is a jealous, bitter monster. She has always hated me because I am beautiful and successful. She fabricated those bank statements to destroy my wedding day because she is completely alone and miserable. Someone call the police on her." Not a single person in the crowd moved. Not a single venture capitalist socialite or family friend offered her an ounce of sympathy. They had seen the federal agents. They had seen the highly detailed bank statements, the foreclosure notices, and the Oratech bankruptcy filings. They knew exactly who the real monsters were. "You can scream all you want, Brittany," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through her hysterics like a scalpel. "But there is no one left in this room who believes your lies. You are not a victim. You are a thief who funded your fake socialite persona with my stolen medical money. The federal agents who just hauled your accomplice out of here already have your bank routing numbers. Screaming at me will not stop the Department of Justice from freezing your accounts by Monday morning." Brittany stared at the cold, unyielding faces of the guests. She looked at my parents, who were still completely paralyzed by their own impending homelessness and public ruin. Richard and Patricia offered her nothing. They could not save her. They could not even save themselves. The realization broke whatever fragile threads of sanity she had left. Her anger instantly evaporated, replaced by a pathetic, overwhelming panic. She spun around to face the only person she thought could still rescue her from total annihilation. She turned to Jamal. Jamal was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying rage. He was not looking at her with love or concern. He was looking at her like she was a parasite that had just destroyed his entire existence. "Jamal, baby, please," Brittany sobbed, her voice dropping into a frantic, high-pitched plea. She threw herself to the floor. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on me, actually fell to her knees in front of 300 people. She scrambled across the polished hardwood, crawling through the puddle of spilled champagne, crushed flowers, and shattered glass from the head table. The sharp fragments of crystal snagged the delicate $20,000 imported lace of her custom wedding gown, tearing the fabric to shreds. The spilled wine soaked into the pristine white tulle, staining her dress, with dark, ugly red splotches that looked remarkably like blood. She did not care. She reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around Jamal's legs, pressing her tear-streaked face against his expensive tuxedo trousers. "You have to help me, Jamal," she begged, sobbing so hard she was choking on her own breath. "She is crazy. My sister is trying to ruin us. But we have each other. We are a team. We are going to build your company back up together. We do not need her money. You are a brilliant CEO. We love each other. Please, you have to tell them we are standing together. We can get past this." Jamal stared down at the weeping, pathetic mess of a woman clinging to his legs. He did not reach down to comfort her. He did not offer her a reassuring word. The man who had strutted around all evening acting like the king of the world had just been publicly castrated by his own financial failures, and he needed someone to absorb his absolute fury. He looked down at Brittany, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. "We love each other," Jamal repeated, his voice dangerously low, dripping with acidic sarcasm. "You think this was about love?" Jamal roughly planted his hand on Brittany's shoulder and violently shoved her away. Brittany shrieked as she was thrown backward, landing hard on the wet, glass-strewn floor. She stared up at him, her mouth hanging open in shock. "Do not ever touch me again!" Jamal roared, his voice echoing fiercely through the ballroom. He stepped forward, looming over her ruined, wine-stained figure. "You lied to me," he shouted, his anger finally boiling over into a spectacular public eruption. "You looked me in the eye every single day for the last year and lied to my face. You paraded around Manhattan acting like you were an heiress. You bragged about your family's massive estate. You demanded a $20,000 wedding dress and a $50,000 diamond ring because you claimed it was the standard for your social class." Jamal laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that conveyed nothing but venom. "Your social class?" Jamal sneered, pointing a finger aggressively at her face. "Your family is bankrupt. Your parents have not paid their mortgage in 6 months. The estate you bragged about is being foreclosed on by your own sister. You do not have a trust fund. You do not have a portfolio. You are a complete and total fraud." Brittany covered her ears, sobbing violently. "I did not know about the house," she wailed defensively. "I swear I did not know they were broke. I just wanted you to be proud of me." "You bought your wedding dress with stolen money," Jamal screamed, cutting off her pathetic excuses. He leaned down, pointing fiercely at her ruined gown. "You are wearing clothes bought with cash you stole from a woman's medical fund. You are a common criminal. You made me look like an absolute fool in front of every major venture capitalist in my network. You sat there and let me disrespect the woman who literally owned my company. You convinced me to let you play that disgusting video, and because of your petty, idiotic high school drama, Apex Capital just pulled $50 million out of my hands." "Jamal, please," Brittany pleaded, clasping her hands together in a desperate prayer. "I can fix this. I will apologize. I will do whatever she wants. Just do not leave me." "Fix this," Jamal spat. "There is no fixing this. Oratech is dead. My reputation is dead. My entire career is over because I married a manipulative, lying thief who used stolen money to trap me." Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box containing the wedding bands they had exchanged just hours earlier at the altar. He ripped the heavy gold band off his own finger. "You thought you were buying into a tech empire," Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh, finalized tone. "And I thought I was buying into a legacy family. We both lost. But I am not going down with a sinking ship." He threw his gold wedding band directly at Brittany. The heavy ring bounced off her collarbone and clattered onto the hardwood floor, rolling away into the shadows. "This wedding is canceled," Jamal announced, projecting his voice so every single guest, investor, and family member could hear his final verdict clearly. "It is over. I am filing for an immediate annulment on the grounds of severe financial fraud. I never want to see your face again." He turned on his heel, not sparing a single glance at my frozen parents or the ruined head table. He marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, shoving past the whispering guests. He walked out the main doors and disappeared into the night, leaving his humiliated, weeping bride completely alone on the floor. I stood watching the entire scene unfold with absolute tranquility. Brittany was left kneeling in a puddle of wine and shattered glass. Her custom dress ruined, her husband gone, her fake wealth exposed, and a federal indictment looming over her head. The golden child had finally plummeted to the earth, and the impact had shattered her beyond repair. The golden child had finally plummeted to the earth, and the impact had shattered her beyond repair. But the symphony of her destruction was missing its final movement. I did not even have to give the signal this time. David, operating with the ruthless efficiency that made him the most feared corporate attorney in Manhattan, raised his hand toward the back of the room. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom, which had just swallowed Trevor and Jamal, swung wide open once again. This time, the people stepping through the threshold were not private security. They were two female federal agents dressed in tactical gear, their gold badges gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. They marched down the center aisle with absolute terrifying purpose. Their heavy boots thudded against the polished hardwood, a steady rhythmic drumbeat that signaled the absolute end of my sister's fraudulent life. Simultaneously, the massive LED screen behind the ruined head table flickered and shifted for the final time. The offshore bank statements vanished. In their place, a heavily redacted but unmistakably official document filled the display. The seal of the United States Department of Justice sat proudly at the top. Below it, typed in bold, undeniable lettering, was a federal arrest warrant. My sister's full legal name was projected in massive black letters for the entire room of 300 guests to see. I turned my gaze back to the floor. Brittany was still kneeling in the puddle of spilled wine and broken glass, her chest heaving as she sobbed over her annulled marriage. She heard the heavy footsteps approaching and slowly lifted her head. Her tear-streaked, mascara-stained face contorted in absolute confusion as the two federal agents stopped directly in front of her. Brittany Ann, the lead agent, stated, her voice projecting a clinical, unyielding authority that cut through the silence of the ballroom. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Brittany stared at the agents, her mouth hanging open. She looked from the badges on their belts to the handcuffs resting in the second agent's hand. Her brain simply could not process the reality of the situation. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in her entire 29 years of existence, was completely paralyzed by the concept of accountability. "This is a mistake," Brittany whispered, her voice trembling. "I am the bride. You cannot arrest me. This is my wedding reception." "The federal government does not care about your seating chart, ma'am," the agent replied coldly. "Stand up, now." When Brittany refused to move, remaining frozen in her puddle of ruined tool and wine, the agents did not hesitate. They reached down, grabbed her by the arms, and forcefully hauled her to her feet. A fresh, blood-curdling shriek tore from Brittany's throat. She began to thrash violently, fighting against the agent's iron grips. She kicked her heels against the hardwood floor, slipping on the spilled champagne as she desperately tried to pull her arms free. But she was a pampered socialite throwing a tantrum, and they were highly trained federal officers. Her resistance lasted exactly 3 seconds. The agent on the right easily overpowered her, twisting Brittany's arms behind her back with practiced mechanical efficiency. The sharp metallic snap of steel handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was deafening. The visual was absolutely poetic. There stood the family golden child, wearing a custom imported lace wedding gown that cost $20,000 of my stolen money. The pristine white fabric was torn to shreds, soaked in dark red wine stains that looked like a crime scene. And binding her wrists together, clashing horribly against the delicate silk sleeves, was a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "Mom!" Brittany screamed, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated terror as the cold metal bit into her skin. "Dad, do something. Do not let them take me. Call somebody. Make them stop." The sound of their precious daughter begging in handcuffs finally snapped my parents out of their catatonic shock. The sheer horror of watching their legacy destroyed before their very eyes jolted them into a frantic, chaotic panic. Patricia and Richard scrambled out of their chairs. They rushed across the dance floor, slipping and stumbling over the debris Jamal had left in his wake. "You cannot take her," Patricia wailed, throwing herself toward the federal agents. She reached out desperately, trying to grab Brittany. "She is just a girl. She did not know what she was doing." "Step back, ma'am," the lead agent ordered, holding up a hand and stepping between my mother and her arrested daughter. "If you interfere with a federal arrest, you will be placed in handcuffs as well." Richard grabbed Patricia by the waist, yanking her back before she could get herself arrested. He looked at the agents, his face pale and covered in a sheen of terrified sweat. "Officers, please." Richard begged, his voice stripped of every ounce of the arrogant patriarchy he had wielded for decades. "This is a family dispute. It is a simple misunderstanding over a shared bank account. We can sort this out civilly. We have money. We can pay the fines." "You do not have a single dime, Richard," I interjected, my voice slicing through his pathetic lies. "And you cannot buy your way out of a federal indictment." Richard and Patricia whipped their heads around to look at me. The realization hit them simultaneously. The federal agents did not care about their excuses. Jamal was gone. Their house was being foreclosed on. They had absolutely zero power, zero leverage, and zero money. The only person in the entire universe who held the keys to their salvation was the daughter they had spent 33 years abusing. My parents dropped to the floor. It was a staggering, monumental collapse. The proud, image-obsessed couple, who cared only about country club memberships and social status, physically fell to their knees in front of me. They ignored the 300 elite guests watching their ultimate humiliation. They ignored the venture capitalists filming the spectacle on their phones. They crawled across the polished wood, stopping just inches from my designer heels. "Clara, I am begging you," Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged sob. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "She is your sister. She made a terrible, stupid mistake, but she does not deserve to go to federal prison. Please, Clara, you have your revenge. You have your money. Just drop the charges. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Withdraw the complaint." Patricia grabbed the hem of my dress, weeping so hysterically she could barely form words. "I will do anything," she cried, her tears dripping onto my shoes. "I will get on my hands and knees and scrub your floors. We will sign the house over to you. We will leave the state and never bother you again. Just please do not let them put my baby in a cage. She will not survive in prison, Clara. I am begging you as your mother, show her some mercy." I looked down at the two people who had given me life. I looked at the man who had stolen my college fund. I looked at the woman who had mocked my infertility to a room full of strangers. I looked past them to my sister, who was currently being dragged toward the exit in handcuffs, crying out for a salvation that would never come. They were expecting me to crack. They were relying on the conditioned, ingrained guilt they had installed in my brain since childhood. They thought that if they humiliated themselves enough, the soft, sensitive daughter they had bullied for decades would miraculously reappear and save them from the consequences of their own actions. But that girl was dead. They had killed her themselves. The woman standing before them was the CEO of Apex Capital Solutions. I was a predator who specialized in hostile takeovers, and I did not negotiate with bankrupt liabilities. "I cannot drop federal charges, Dad," I explained, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying serenity. "I did not file a civil lawsuit. I handed ironclad evidence of interstate wire fraud and aggravated identity theft directly to the Department of Justice. The moment that money crossed state lines into an offshore account, it became property of the federal government. I am not prosecuting your daughter. The United States of America is prosecuting your daughter. It is entirely out of my hands." Richard let out a devastated, hollow wail. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cold, wine-stained floor. Patricia continued to sob, clutching her chest as if her heart had physically shattered. I looked down at them, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. The scales were finally balanced. The debt had been paid in full. I slowly tilted my head to the side, adopting the exact same condescending, arrogant posture my father had used against me at the beginning of the reception. A cold, perfect smile curved onto my lips. I looked directly into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes. Just a joke, sweetheart, I whispered softly. Learn to laugh at yourself for once in your life. I turned and walked out of that ballroom, leaving the wreckage of my former family behind. The cool ocean air hit my face as I stepped out of the estate, and for the first time in 33 years, I took a breath that belonged entirely to me. 1 year later, the wind whipping across the private balcony of my Manhattan headquarters carried a completely different energy. I stood 50 stories above the bustling streets, holding a sleek ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the city wake up. The skyline was a concrete jungle of glass and steel, an unforgiving ecosystem of predators and prey. I had never felt more at home. David stepped out onto the terrace, his tailored suit immaculate as always. He handed me a thick leather-bound portfolio containing the latest quarterly earnings report for Auratech. I opened the file, running my eyes over the crisp black text and upward trending graphs. The numbers were absolutely staggering. After formally seizing the company, my first order of business had been to completely dismantle the toxic corporate culture Jamal Washington had built. I stripped away his bloated executive compensation packages, terminated his ridiculous vanity projects, and installed a highly competent, ruthless board of directors. I specifically appointed a brilliant, no-nonsense female CEO to take his place, a deliberate choice that I knew would sting his fragile ego even more. Under our new management, Auratech had not just stabilized, it had exploded. We were up 400% in annual recurring revenue. The company was now a crown jewel in the Apex Capital portfolio. As for Jamal, he was nothing but a cautionary tale whispered among venture capitalists over expensive lunches. He had attempted to launch a new software startup a few months ago, desperately trying to re-enter the tech sphere. But his name was pure, unadulterated poison. No angel investor would touch him. No bank would approve a business loan. He was currently facing multiple civil lawsuits from his former vendors and contractors, completely bankrupt and entirely irrelevant. The man who had mocked me and told me the weak get eaten alive had been thoroughly devoured by the very industry he claimed to rule. I handed the portfolio back to David with a satisfied nod. He took it, offering a small, knowing smile before providing me with the monthly legal updates. I had maintained absolute, impenetrable silence since the night of the wedding. 0 phone calls, 0 emails, 0 holiday cards. My security team intercepted and instantly destroyed any correspondence my former family attempted to send. But David, ever the thorough and protective attorney, kept a watchful eye on the legal and financial fallout, ensuring they could never pose a threat to me again. My parents had officially been evicted from their $5 million estate exactly 30 days after I foreclosed on the property. According to the asset recovery reports, it was a humiliating spectacle. The bank seized everything. The repo men arrived early on a Tuesday morning to tow away my father's prized Porsche Cayenne, the exact vehicle he had purchased with my stolen college tuition. They had tried to fight the foreclosure, desperately begging their wealthy friends for loans, but the socialite crowd had watched their public unmasking at the wedding. No one wanted anything to do with them. Without Jamal's imaginary wealth or my stolen money to bail them out, Patricia and Richard were swiftly crushed by the harsh reality of their massive debt. They were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Patricia, the woman who used to scoff at guests wearing last season's designer labels, was now clipping grocery coupons and taking public transportation. Richard had been forced to swallow his massive pride and take a job as a mid-level manager at a regional logistics firm, reporting to a boss half his age just to keep the lights on. The fake elite friends they had lied to and desperately tried to impress had completely abandoned them. They were social pariahs living out their remaining days in the exact squalor and mediocrity they had always mocked. Trevor, of course, fared no better. While Brittany had managed to secure a plea deal due to being a first-time offender who folded immediately under pressure, Trevor was the primary architect of the bank fraud. He was currently sitting in a minimum security federal correctional facility, serving a 36-month sentence. The man who had walked out on me, claiming I was a defective wife, was now spending his days doing menial prison labor for pennies an hour. His promising career was dead, his reputation was in ashes, and the post-nuptial agreement he had so arrogantly signed ensured he could not touch a single cent of my fortune to pay for a better lawyer. And then there was the golden child. Federal agents had stripped her apartment bare within days of the wedding. All the designer bags, the luxury shoes, the expensive jewelry, it was all seized, catalogued, and auctioned off by the government to pay her restitution. She avoided a prison cell, but she did not escape punishment. She was a convicted felon. The judge sentenced her to 5 years of strict federal probation, 500 hours of community service, and mandatory financial restitution. Because of her felony record for wire fraud and identity theft, no corporate office would hire her. The woman who once demanded a $20,000 custom wedding dress was now working 35 hours a week as a waitress at a cheap chain restaurant just to make her court-ordered payments. She had to wear a stain-resistant polyester uniform and a plastic name tag, taking orders and wiping down sticky tables for the very working-class people she used to treat like absolute garbage. Her Instagram account, once her most prized possession and the primary source of her fabricated reality, had been permanently deleted by court order. She had no followers, no rich husband, and no stolen money to fund her delusions. She was experiencing the exact humiliation and physical exhaustion she had inflicted on others forced to live in the harsh, unforgiving real world without a safety net. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm morning sun on my face. I did not feel a single pang of guilt for any of them. They had built their lives on a foundation of cruelty, theft, and deception. I had simply removed the foundation and let gravity do the rest. I turned my back to the city skyline and walked off the balcony, stepping back into the quiet luxury of my corner office. My desk was clear, my mind was sharp, and my empire was waiting. David stepped forward and placed one final thick folder in the center of my desk. This one did not bear the harsh red stamps of a hostile takeover or a corporate bankruptcy. It was bound in crisp white leather. I opened the cover, my eyes scanning the heavily vetted legal framework inside. It was the official charter for the Apex Empowerment Fund. I had authorized a $50 million initial endowment to establish this trust. Its sole purpose was to provide aggressive, top-tier legal representation and immediate financial relief to women trapped in economically abusive families. I designed it for women whose credit scores had been ruined by parasitic parents, women whose bank accounts had been drained by manipulative, deceitful husbands, women who had been systematically stripped of their independence and repeatedly told they were worthless, broken, or irredeemable. I knew exactly what it felt like to stand in the dark, completely isolated, believing the crushing narrative your own blood relatives forced upon you. I built this foundation to ensure that the next time a woman found herself backed into a corner by the people who were supposed to protect her, she would not have to fight her way out alone. She would have an entire corporate army standing directly behind her, ready to go to war on her behalf. I reached for my favorite fountain pen, uncapping it with a smooth, satisfying click. But before I brought the ink to the bottom line, my gaze drifted to the far right corner of my mahogany desk. Sitting perfectly centered under the warm glow of a small desk lamp was a custom-made silver plaque. Engraved into the polished metal in the exact same harsh, glaring font my sister had used on that colossal LED screen a year ago was a single word: failure. A soft, genuine smile curved my lips. I looked at that word, remembering the suffocating humiliation I had felt when it first flashed across the ballroom. My parents and my sister had intended for that label to be my public execution. They wanted it to be the definitive summary of my entire existence. Instead, it became the ignition switch for my absolute liberation. I kept the plaque on my desk as a daily glittering trophy. It was a beautiful reminder that the most dangerous thing you can ever do is underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. I shifted my attention back to the charter. With a steady hand and a clear, unburdened heart, I signed my name across the dotted line, officially bringing the fund to life. I handed the closed folder back to David. He gave me a respectful nod and silently exited the office, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the city below. I turned my leather chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the sweeping golden view of the Manhattan skyline. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the punching bag. I had forged my own empire on my own terms, surrounded by people who valued my brilliance over my blind obedience. Family isn't blood. It's who is standing next to you when the screen goes dark. The story of Clara serves as a powerful reminder that biology does not automatically equate to loyalty, respect, or love. One of the most profound lessons we can extract from her journey is that family is an earned title, not a mandatory life sentence. For years, Clara's relatives weaponized her vulnerabilities, using the concept of familial duty to excuse their own greed, deception, and cruelty. They demanded endless grace while offering nothing but public humiliation in return. However, Clara's ultimate triumph wasn't just in exposing their financial crimes or reclaiming her stolen funds. It was in the profound realization that she had the power to redefine her own inner circle. True empowerment comes from setting immovable boundaries and recognizing that walking away from toxic blood relatives is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-preservation. When the people meant to protect you become your greatest source of pain, you owe it to yourself to cut the ties and build an empire of your own making. Evaluate the relationships in your life by their actions rather than their titles, and have the courage to walk away from anyone who diminishes your light.